Welcome back to the parillaworks channel. My name is John. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this low back chair out of solid cherry. It features hand-turned dowels, a sculpted seat, and some cool cocobolo accent plugs. The first step, as always, was to mill up my material. I'm using 8/4 stock for everything you'll see here. The seat is about 20 inches wide, so I made sure to get a board that was around 11 inches wide so that I could double it up nicely. I tried to pick the most interesting pieces to make up the seat so that I could show it off after the sculpting was done. Every other part of the chair would be a dowel ranging from 1 inch in diameter all the way up to 2.5 inches. Because I'm using 8/4 stock, I was able to get my 1 inch, 1.5 inch, and 2 inch dowels out of a single blank. My 2.5 inch dowels will come from 2 pieces glued together. Sometimes 8/4 material won't yield a true 2 inch thick piece, but luckily I was able to get the 2 inch dowels without laminating material. The seat blank was milled down to about 1 3/4 inches thick and glued together. All of the dowel blanks were milled oversized by about 1/4 inch, which would give me extra material to work with on the lathe. At this point, I took a few months off to work on some other projects. Once I came back to this build, I decided to get started on the leg joinery. I used the same method as my cherry dowel bench from earlier this year, though after doing this twice on 2 different projects, I think I've come up with a better way that I'll try to use next time. I created a template out of plywood that would let me route a perfect semicircle into the seat. The back legs are 2.5 inches in diameter, while the front legs are 1.5 inches. I use the same template for both sides to ensure consistent spacing. The jigsaw comes in handy to rough out the material, and then a 2 inch flush trim bit can finish the rest of the job. Now I can turn my attention to the dowels. In my previous video, I used a shop-made jig to turn the dowels with a router. That worked out pretty well, but I decided to give the lathe a shot. I bought the extension for my mini lathe, which allows me to turn spindles up to 40 inches long. I also bought some new turning tools. The tool you see me using for all of these dowels is from Harrison Specialties. I bought the medium set that comes with 1 handle and 3 interchangeable heads. For these dowels, I mostly use the square rougher and the radius square rougher. Turning these dowels was a lot less daunting than I was anticipating. There are only a few key spots where the diameter is critical, and those are the spots I was extra careful with. I started out by roughing the spindle to a cylinder, and then I marked the critical spots, which were areas that had to fit into the seat mortise or other holes throughout the chair. I used a piece of plywood with the proper diameter hole to work down the spindle. For most of the dowels, I did this every 1.5 to 2 inches, and then I could come back and connect the dots. It's much easier to connect multiple small paths than it is to connect one long one. Once I got a relatively consistent diameter, I could begin sanding. I'll admit my turning wasn't perfect, so I did do a bunch of sanding. To keep the dowels straight, I attached my low grit papers to a block of MDF. This prevented any dips and valleys from forming. I started with 60 grit and worked up to 80, 100, 120, 150, 220, and lastly, burnishing with wood shavings. The 1 inch dowels were the most difficult because I kept getting a lot of chatter and flex over the 20 inch span. And on the other hand, the thicker dowels were much more sturdy and thus easier to turn and came out with a nicer finish. This was a pretty fun experience and I'm glad I gave it a shot. I didn't have any crazy mistakes because I took my time. Each dowel took me between 20 and 25 minutes, which sounds long when the final result is a simple cylinder. Buying dowels at these sizes in species like cherry or walnut can get expensive very quickly, and turning these by hand gave me a good idea why. Here you can see all of the octagonal blanks before turning, and then the cylinders after turning. The next step was to drill the holes so that I could connect all of the dowels. The flow of the chair starts with the 1-inch stretcher that connects to a 1.5-inch front leg, which connects to a 2-inch armrest, which finally connects to the 2.5-inch back leg. I used a V-block to help stabilize the workpiece and mostly drilled by eye to make sure the holes were centered. I'll admit there are much better ways to do this, but I got pretty good results nonetheless. I think next time I'll create a box for the cylinder to sit in and use the dowel max to center my holes correctly. The back legs were the only pieces to have holes on perpendicular faces, and this again was done by eye and worked out pretty well. The first dry fit was pretty cool to see, but like most chair builds, there was still a lot of work to be done. I wanted to add a subtle curve to the backrest to help provide a little comfort and visual interest. I whipped up this little jig that can cradle the dowel and be used to template route with a flush trim bit. I used the bandsaw to rough out the extra material and came back with the router to clean it up. The lowest backrest has the least material removed, and the highest has the most removed. I did this using a spacer in the back of the jig so that certain pieces would protrude further out from the jig. I think a fixture like this can be really handy for any type of dowel flush trimming, and it's something I want to explore more with using dowels as legs for a table. I also added some curves to the front and back of the seat, similar to those on the dowel bench. These were added using a similar method, rough out at the bandsaw, and flush up with the router. Sculpting the seat was one part of this build I was really excited for, but I was also nervous that I would mess it up. I drew out the shape by eye and made it as symmetrical as I could. Then I got to it with a kutzall grinding dish. This is a carbide abrasive dish that attaches to an angle grinder and is pretty common for sculpting wood. This was my first time using an attachment like this, and it was really fun. I drilled some depth markers so that I knew how deep to go in certain areas. I wanted the back to be the deepest and gradually contour up to the front. I did all of the shaping outside of the shop because this creates a ton of dust. I don't have much advice other than to say to take your time. Once I got to a consistent and acceptable shape, I started sanding. The coarse dish I used leaves a pretty rough finish that I would equate to 30 or 40 grit paper, maybe rougher. I used a combination of my orbital sander and a 2-inch sanding disc for my drill to smooth everything out. I started at 60 grit and gradually worked all the way up to 220 grit. There was no shortage of hand sanding, and I also raised the grain with water to help get a smoother finish. Beyond the seat, there was still a lot of hand sanding to do. I went through similar grits as well as raising the grain to get the dowels ready. I also added some edge profiles to the dowels and seat. The seat received a 45-degree chamfer, while the dowels received a 1/8 inch roundover. On to the big glue up. There are a lot of things to worry about with a glue up like this, and for that reason, I recommend you use a glue with a long open time. I did not, but it still worked out just fine. I used a bucket and a few pieces of melamine to give the seat the proper height. Then I assembled each side consisting of a front leg, a back leg, a stretcher, and an armrest. I did multiple dry fits, but the glue swelled up some of the joints, which made things a bit hectic. I tried to be conservative with the glue in the seat mortises because squeeze out would be tough to clean up. The backrests were oriented properly so that the curves I added would cradle the user's back nicely. One issue I ran into was a slight cupping in the seat, and I think this was caused while shaping it in my driveway. I let it sit in the sun a little too long, and that caused it to cup, and this means that the seat mortises weren't completely square to the floor. I was able to clamp everything up, but it took some coaxing. My camera also died right as I was trying to fix one of my clamps. Just like my dowel bench, I reinforced these joints with screws. Like I mentioned earlier, I think I figured out a stronger and simpler method to create a joint like this. It would be more similar to the Maloof joint, which is what I was going for in the first place. I filled the screw holes with some cocobolo plugs, trimmed the excess with a little pole saw, and sanded them flush. The last step before finish was to add the parillaworks brand. Just like the times when you were a For the finish, I applied 2 coats of Danish oil. The first coat went on heavy and was allowed to soak in for a few minutes. I used 4-0 steel wool to apply the oil, and once it had soaked in, I came back and wiped it completely dry with fresh paper towels. This chair won't see daily use, so the Danish oil should be enough protection and will still provide a nice close to the wood feel. And that about wraps up this build. I've always heard that chairs are some of the more complicated projects you can take on, and rightfully so. There are a lot of parts that need to be made accurately, and they have to be joined in such a way that they can take a beating. The ergonomics need to be well thought out so that the chair is comfortable to use and also aesthetically pleasing. This chair turned out pretty comfortable, though the armrests are a little low, but overall it turned out better than I could have hoped for. I'm glad I turned the dowels on the lathe because it's opened me up to taking on some more turning projects. The sculpted seat provides a stark contrast to the uniform and rigid dowels, which is part of the design aesthetic I was going for. If you want to see projects like this while they're in progress, follow me on Instagram at parillaworks. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching.